Leak of financial documents has exposed the secret dealings of some of the world's richest people. Almost 12 million files and documents were obtained by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and examined by more than 600 journalists from 117 countries. Known as the Pandora Papers, the documents reveal that King Abdullah II of Jordan has built up a property empire worth more than $100 million, including properties in Malibu, Washington, D.C., London and Ascot in the UK. His lawyers say all properties were bought with personal wealth. Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev, his family and close associates have been involved in property deals in the UK worth more than $500 million. The Aliyevs, who've been accused of looting their own country, used offshore companies to buy UK property, including a $45 million office block for the president's 11-year-old son. Well, the revelations could prove particularly damaging to the UK government, highlighting its failure to establish a register of offshore property owners, despite repeatedly promising to do so. Will Fitzgibbon is a senior reporter for the group behind the release of the documents.
One of the names that jumped out to us all immediately, the reporters looking through these data, was the King of Jordan, Abdullah II. That's on one hand because we found his passport literally in these documents, but also the sheer number of shell companies and secret property purchases that we were able to establish. These are properties worth over more than $100 million that shell companies connected to the king have purchased over the years, including many multi-million-dollar properties in a very fancy neighborhood in California that were purchased during or after the Arab Spring revelations. There's no indication or suggestion in our reporting that this is indeed illegal, but I think we have certainly asked the king, why were these purchases made through shell companies? Why has none of this been disclosed publicly? And what, if any, connection do these purchases have to the state of Jordan? And experts we speak to say that it will be terribly embarrassing for a king who prides himself on a reputation as a modernist and an ally of the West. I would say other names that jumped out at me were obviously the president of Kenya, who literally appears as a second beneficiary of a secretive foundation in Panama. Again, this is a president who, for many years, and even a few years ago, sat down with a BBC interviewer and said, if anyone has something to tell us that we haven't been transparent about, let them tell us. And I suppose today, with the Pandora Papers, we're doing just that.
Rory Challens has more on the European leaders mentioned in the papers.
The Pandora Papers are essentially reinforcing what we already knew, which is that London property is a very convenient, buoyant way for some of the world's most rich and wealthy and powerful people to park what can often be dodgy cash. One kind of example, not necessarily of all of this, but of some of it, is Tony and Cherie Blair, Tony Blair being the former British Prime Minister. What they did, it seems, is to use an offshore company in the British Virgin Islands to help them buy a multi-million-pound property in London and avoid paying thousands of dollars worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth in property tax. Now, is this illegal? No, it's not, because it's tax avoidance, which is perhaps morally questionable, but legally it's okay. Many other European figures are going to be coming out of these documents in the days and weeks to come. Two who have already leapt to the fore, one of whom is President Zelensky of Ukraine, who, in his campaign to become president, was very critical of his forerunner, Petro Poroshenko, an oligarch who Zelensky said was corrupt and was squirreling cash overseas. Well, it seems that Zelensky has been doing something not completely dissimilar. Together with a group of associates from his TV comedy days, it looks like he was participating in an offshore scheme which allowed him to not declare some of his assets. Prime Minister Andrej Babiš of the Czech Republic, who is actually up for re-election later this week, it seems he used a very convoluted offshore scheme to help with the purchase of a multi-billion-dollar property in the south of France. Will that hurt his re-election chances? Well, we'll have to wait and see. That's elections coming up later this week.
Let's talk more about all this with Mayra Martini. She's a research and policy expert on corruption money flows at Transparency International. She joins us live from Berlin by Skype. Thanks for being with us. So many governments have talked in the past about the importance of, corporations and wealthy people paying their fair share of taxes, and yet it seems that many of these leaders have been doing the opposite of that. What do you make of the kind of scale of revelations we've seen here?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Let me start by congratulating the journalists who work on these revelations, because once again, we have to rely on them and their brave and brilliant work to shed light on the potential abuses of the financial system. To put a little bit in context, no? So we're talking about 330 politicians from 90 countries who are seeking secrecy with the help of lawyers, accountants, and bankers. And how they were seeking secrecy? By opening anonymous companies in different jurisdictions, where their names and the real owners of these companies were not disclosed and very often not even recorded by authorities. And I think what is very concerning is that, as you said, many of those are the ones in position of power. So we're talking about presidents, we're talking about prime ministers, we're talking about ministers and central bank governors, who actually are the ones who should be making the decisions and taking actions to tackle the flow of dirty money. But they're actually the ones abusing the opacity of the system and benefiting from the current status quo, right? So that's what is really, really concerning with these revelations.
I suppose one thing that people would say in their defence is that it's not technically illegal to set up or benefit from an offshore company, but I suppose it allows for a kind of climate where people can hide things, and therefore people who are hiding things or evading tax specifically can get away with it. What do you think needs to happen to change that?
So we think that three main things need to happen, and I think these revelations today make those very clear. They were already very clear with the Panama Papers back in 2016. But I think number one, what needs to happen is that it shouldn't be possible to hide behind anonymous companies anymore. So we need to make sure that once someone incorporates a company or creates a trust, they need to provide information about the real natural individuals who control and benefit from these companies. And this information needs to be checked by authorities, right? To make sure that no one is trying to game the system. And then you need to make this information available to everyone. Every citizen, journalist, the police should be able to check the owner of a company that is operating in their neighborhood or in their country. And then the second thing that needs to change is, and this is clear with these revelations, is that the networks that support criminals. So criminals and the corrupt, they're not really operating alone. They have a networks of lawyers, accountants, and corporate service providers that they need to be regulated. They need to conduct checks on their clients. They need to know the source of funds of their clients. And they shouldn't be allowed to borrow their names as company directors and shareholders without consequences. And this is what we have seen. And important financial centers also in the middle of this story, like the US or Switzerland, still don't have such rules in place. And the third thing that needs to change is that these people need to be held accountable. We need to see investigations and we need to see sanctions, not only to these 300 politicians that are named in those stories if they're found to be involved in wrongdoing, but also to these professionals, the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers, who are helping them to remain anonymous and to move money across borders that end up in luxury properties in the UK, in the US, in bank accounts in Dubai, in Switzerland, and so on.